Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It's March 20th, 2025, and today we have a scandalously named episode for you. This is our guest's title for today's show. He's calling it Disinformation Addiction and Joseph Smith Polygamy Denialism. I was calling it something like a Mormon historian responds to, Joseph Smith polygamy denial. But for those of you who have not been regular viewers or listeners of Mormon Stories Podcast, there's a very old and a quite new movement of faithful Latter-day Saints to deny that Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, ever practiced polygamy. Recently, we had Michelle Stone, who's viewed by many as the leader of the modern sort of movement to perpetuate the idea that Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy. We had her on Mormon Stories Podcast recently. It was a 6-hour episode. I believe she's a lovely person, good heart, super smart. And she told her basic Mormon story and then shared her opinions and perspectives in a limited form about why she believes that Joseph Smith did not practice polygamy. And we've also done an episode on LDS discussions about it. But when I was thinking about who probably my favorite person in the world, I think I could safely say to address this topic, it's none other than John Hamer. So let me bring him on now. John Hamer will not be an unfamiliar voice to Mormon Stories superfans. He's been on Mormon Stories Podcast at least 11 times, but I'll bring him on now. Hey, John Hamer, thanks for joining us today on Mormon Stories.
Hi, John. I'm so happy to be back here. Always love hanging out with you, and also love your audience, your program, everything. So thank you for having me.
Likewise. We've had John Hamer in the past. The very first episode was episode 116, released January 24th, 2010. So he's an OG. And the title of that was The LDS Succession Crisis. We've had John talking about joining the community of Christ as sort of a progressive or a post-Mormon. He's talked about, he responded about the LDS Church's polygamy essays when they came out back in 2014. He has talked about folk magic, Joseph Smith, and Mormon origins. John, you'll be interested to know that I was hanging out with my brother Joel this past weekend in Florida. And he just, of his own accord, was watching your series on the creation of the Book of Mormon, its 19th century context, and your views on how the Book of Mormon was created, which I think is one of the best, if not the best series we've ever done on, a thoughtful person's origins to the Book of Mormon. And we've done several other episodes, including some stuff on Mark Hoffman, Undefining God, Redefining God, and Rethinking Spirituality. John Hamer, tell our guests just a tiny bit about you, who you are, and please tell them about what you're doing right now as well.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a 7th generation Latter-day Saint. So I was born in the LDS Church, born and raised as a mission field Mormon, but deconstructed that for myself when I was a teenager, when I didn't believe that the Book of Mormon or the Book of Abraham had historicity. And then really by the time I became an adult and could decide for myself, I left the church, left the movement as a religion for a whole long time and went off into the academic study of history and was very interested in that. But I was still interested in this as a culture. And I also, then when I encountered Community of Christ, and I didn't believe them at first, that a church could actually not have a lot of be based on a lot of false truth claims, including especially one that traces its origin to Joseph Smith. But I liked a lot of the progressive things in the direction that it had gone. And having connected with a lot of ex-Mormons, I thought, well, this might be a great home for ex-Mormons who are still interested in a religious movement. And then over the course of 10 years of that kind of seeking and my relationship with the church, I ended up joining the church myself. And that today I serve as the pastor of the downtown Toronto congregation of Community of Christ. Our Beyond the Walls global broadcast is the church's largest online ministry. So we live stream every Sunday, and we have usually 1,000 people watch over the course of the week. And we also I maintain a YouTube channel called centerplace.ca. That's our website. But anyway, the Centerplace channel, where pretty much on Tuesdays I talk about how can we have exploration of spirituality or even Christianity or restoration tradition without having to rely on truth claims that are not able to be held up, in terms of history and other academic sciences. So I lecture on topics like that every Tuesday.
I love it. And for those of you who, if I can just add my endorsement, I personally would put John Hamer in the top 5 people I personally know and have a relationship with in terms of total knowledge of Mormon Church history. That's just my opinion. John, you may reject that categorically. Brilliant mind, but also a really good heart and a really good person who has not just checked out of sort of the restorationist tradition, but has done more than almost anyone I know to try and support thoughtful and compassionate and ethical engagement with the Latter-day Saint restoration tradition. So and he does great visuals. He's a graphic designer. He has a master's from the University of Michigan, I believe, in cartography. Is that right, John?
And, it was in history, but my focus is on medieval mapping and things like that. So you remember that, yeah.
And also, you were a editor, co-editor, or president of the John Whitmer Historical Association, right?
So I've been president of the John Whitmer Historical Association. Okay. I was the initial editor, the founding editor for John Whitmer books, and so on. I've done a lot of work in university presses, publishing, that kind of thing.
And haven't you done maps literally for the Joseph Smith Papers Project as well?
Yeah. Yep. So I've done maps for the Joseph Smith Papers Project and for Herald House, which is the Community of Christ version. And so I've fortunately been able to, I think because I have a constructive, positive attitude about the restoration, my restoration heritage, even though there's a partisan divide between, different groups, I actually have quite a good relationship, I think, with the history department of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with obviously the historian community and Community of Christ, John Whitmer, and the Mormon History Association, and other groups, and actually have a good relationship with fundamentalist Mormons, with all of the different branches of the restoration tradition, because I'm actually, I think quite positive and sympathetic to the movement and us wanting to be able to embrace this heritage that we share. So
I love it. All right. Well, with that intro, John, let's dive in. I'm going to hit this title head on. Disinformation, Addiction, and Joseph Smith Polygamy Denialism. I'm sure that Michelle Stone is going to interpret that as an attack. I'm not going to defend her in this episode, other than to say she really doesn't like the term polygamy denier. She feels like it associates her unfairly with conspiracy theorists. She feels like she's sincere and evidence-based. And again, this isn't going to be me defending her, but because I respect a lot about what she does, I just wanted to kind of at least start by saying that. And other than that, I just want to hear the great things you have to say.
Yeah. Well, and again, I don't meaning this to be focused on Michelle. Obviously, she's the most prominent spokesperson right now. I think it's not the only person who has been engaged in this. I think in terms of what I think, though, is making what I'm going to argue here in this presentation, people who are in the restoration tradition, who are very earnest in their view, but who are doing an apologetic work and making a faith claim that is more akin to the way LDS people have sometimes done apologetics than following a methodologically sound or consistent approach that is historical. So in other words, this is why I actually unfortunately think this at present is definitely grouped into conspiracy theory and other sections like that. And so I want to make that case. And I'm actually the whole reason why I focused in on this topic as of 10 years ago, when Rock Waterman was first kind of promoting this idea among this group that has become known as the Remnant, the snuffer community. I think that it's because I'm actually interested very much in the situation that we are facing in the 21st century, where there is a broad rejection by a whole host of the population of expertise, a willingness to kind of just say any ideas are equally valid, whether or not it is has some kind of accepted scientific or academically methodological underpinning, where it actually is a tested idea versus just some random idea that someone might say, that those are weighed equally nowadays often, and that this is part of then a general trend which that includes embracing of conspiracy theories that I'm kind of calling disinformation addiction. And this is something I frankly preach about as one of the what I said is the actual horsemen of the 21st century apocalypse. One of the things that are really affecting our society in negative ways, I think.
Love it. So if you don't mind, you being a member and even a leader in Community of Christ, whose former name was the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that puts you close to this topic in particular very intimately. So for those, over half of our audience has never been Mormon. And then a bunch of our audience is brand new to any of this and have never even really heard of the RLDS Church. Can you briefly just explain to everyone why Community of Christ / the RLDS Church would have particular interest or historical focus on this topic?
Yeah. So polygamy is ultimately the central issue that of Mormonism and of Mormon history, because when Joseph Smith started secretly teaching his followers polygamy, and it broadly bringing in a broad group of loyalists in Nauvoo in the 1840s, when he started having himself sealed to, as it's called in terms of a Mormon term for marriage, to number of women and girls in Nauvoo, including, for example, my great-great-great-great-grandparents' 15-year-old daughter, Nancy Mariah Winchester. When all of that was going on, he irrevocably changed the course of the history of the movement and also caused the movement to fracture. So a bunch of loyalists, a majority of the loyalists in Nauvoo were in favor of that, but many people were very much opposed and scandalized. People, including a special member of the First Presidency named William Law, who broke from Joseph Smith and published an expose of what was going on. Joseph Smith had proposed some kind of probably it's theorized anyway. We don't have as good of information about this, but people like Grant Palmer have done the research on William Law's testimony and have determined that, for example, that Joseph Smith may have proposed wife swapping with William Law and his wife. But in any event, whatever happened there, William Law broke with Joseph Smith, exposed polygamy by publishing the Nauvoo Expositor. Joseph Smith used his authority as the mayor to destroy the press, which caused a revolt all around the country in terms of a religious leader holding secular authority and using that to destroy a free press. It rankled Republican idealism with the small r republicanism of the era, and that ultimately led to Joseph Smith's death at the hands of a mob within a few months after that. And so the people in the movement, like William Law ultimately just leaves and becomes an ex-Mormon, but there were many others within Nauvoo and especially around in the branches who were opposed to polygamy. Loyalists like Brigham Young, for example, who ended up seizing or taking control of the institutional church in Nauvoo and then ultimately moving west into the leadership of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah. That continued what had been a completely secret practice to bringing it into the public. Meanwhile, the opponents of polygamy in the Midwest, centering around Joseph Smith's legal wife, Emma, and her children, especially the eldest son, Joseph Smith III. They formed what became known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which continued to oppose polygamy, and that ultimately becomes Community of Christ. But part of that opposition of polygamy, so it had what was under Joseph III, active denial that Joseph Smith had any involvement in it. And that, unfortunately, that founding error, or that founding misstatement that Joseph III made, ultimately, I think, is very costly to his movement. It made it so that he was not able to win back a majority of the Utah Saints who were ensconced in polygamy and knew actually that Joseph Smith, his father, had been involved. And then ultimately, having this kind of foundational error when it was another trauma when Community of Christ started to wrestle with all of the different false faith or history claims, like, for example, historicity of the Book of Mormon. And so that has led to the church's very significant decline in the 21st century. So,
and there was a point where the RLDS Church, did they just announce, they decided it and then announced that they no longer held the position that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy? And if so, when was that?
So, so the church really didn't ever announce that.
Oh.
So, what happened is that that as of the 1970s, as of the first time the church had members who were trained historians. So the movement, until the time period that we now call the New Mormon History, which is post-World War II time period, until that time, actually academically trained historians were not involved in writing the history of the movement, and there were no historians who were either RLDS or LDS. In other words, church historians were people who were general authorities who had no historical training. They just were people like Joseph Fielding Smith, who were interested in history, but they're not that they were interested in telling identity stories that are sacred myths, and they didn't have the training to actually do academic history. So that changed with Leonard Arrington in the Utah tradition, and then in the Missouri tradition, and the Community of Christ tradition with Dick Howard, who was the first academically trained historian of the RLDS Church. Dick did then research on this and found out that the evidence is conclusive. Joseph Smith is the origin, did practice polygamy, and he is the origin of it. And so then he ended up, giving that report to the first presidency of the RLDS Church. They deemed it, I think, to be far too explosive dynamite, to actually publish in an official church publication. Dick Howard was allowed to write a heavily massaged and pulling the conclusions back kind of essay in an independent publication, so a journal called Restoration Studies, and also simultaneously in the John Whitmer Historical Association Journal. And so he was able to publish an idea that, well, maybe so, maybe not, I think, is kind of how the evidence was very clear, but he didn't draw conclusions from it. And that continues to be kind of where the church officially has wanted to be. What ended up happening in the 2000s is that Steve Veazey, the president of the church in the 2000s and also to the present, issued a document called The Principles of History for Community of Christ, which state that the church does not take any official positions on history. So the church simply retreated from taking positions on history at all officially. And Mark Shearer was under extreme scrutiny from the first presidency, which was scared that there were people who in the church that are polygamy deniers or whatever, that still had that as a faith claim, not a historical claim, but they believed it was historical, but it's just a faith claim. So because of that, they didn't want to publish that. And in fact, my book, which is a very tiny little book called The Community of Christ and Illustrated History, published in 2010 by Herald House, was the very first public acknowledgement by the RLDS Church, the Community of Christ, that Joseph Smith did institute polygamy. So in other words, it was all the way to 2010 in my book that the church officially acknowledged it by printing a history book that says that he did it. So yeah.
Was there ever a point where the Community of Christ, paid a price for reversing its position, or for acknowledging internally, at least, that Joseph Smith actually did practice polygamy? And if so, is it fair to say that number one, they're good historians at Community of Christ, but also they would have had every interest, if there was good evidence to support that Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy, or if there was just no evidence, no conclusive evidence that he did? Is it fair to say Community of Christ would have had every interest in perpetuating the position that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy?
If it was a matter that was open to question, then we would have wanted to have it be, we would have never wanted to take the position that Joseph Smith had founded polygamy. So yes, absolutely. When my book came out, there was a wonderful gentleman here in my congregation who he bought the book because he wanted to support me. But then when he got to the infamous page 13 of the book, the first time that any historian in all of the Community of Christ had been able to publish a book on the church's official press, so Herald House, which is like our Deseret book, that was the first time it had done. It just shook him. He's just like, this is not what I've been taught all my life. He was in his 80s, and there were lots and lots of people who had that reaction to me and my co-authors, David Howlett and Barbara Walden, who were wonderful Community of Christ historians, and we are attempting, in the way we framed that, to be incredibly pastoral. But we still will get that reaction from old members. And so, yeah, it would have been, if we could have said it any other way, if there was some way to validly say there's some room for fudging here, and maybe this or maybe not, but the answer is no. It's conclusive. There's a historical consensus. Joseph Smith is the origin of Mormon polygamy. So,
all right. Well, let's dig into your presentation then, shall we?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Here we go. And you just tell me when to change.
Yeah,
I'll switch it between you and the slides.
Okay. Well, like I say, I've provocatively titled this, right? So, disinformation addiction. And so, in some ways, I'm a futurist. I'm a fan of science fiction, fairly famously a Star Trek fan, but I'm also a Star Wars fan. And, people have before, I'm in the library in the heritage room of the congregation here, but I've also done podcasts with you in the chapel, which has all the glowing spiral and lights behind it. And people have said, John Hamer's coming from, I don't know, the Death Star or wherever it is, or from the Enterprise, in order to contact you. So in other words, I've often would like to have us achieve like that vision of the future that I had as a little kid when I'm watching Star Trek as a Star Trek fan, of sometime we're going to have a more egalitarian society where, which is not going to be racist, it's not going to be sexist, where we are able to have abundance and not have to worry about possessions and selfishness or whatever, because we're worrying about instead enriching ourselves. And so in some ways, when the computer age and the information age happened, I was one of those kind of optimistic visionaries who felt this is a way where we're finally going to get away from this tyranny of the three television networks that you and I grew up in, John. The three broadcast news things, that we're now going to get to a place where everybody democratically can be making their own content. There will be able to be huge independent channels like Mormon Stories here, or like my channel, and so forth. But one of the things that has also happened, with the explosion of the internet and the information age, is that we are also now in a golden age of disinformation, because people can put out anything. There had always been people who had hokey theories or conspiracy theories and that sort of thing. But now they have, they're not just publishing little newsletters to each other. It is now people are able to group en masse and spread these things around. And so we're now in a place where large sections of the population reject expertise. They reject the idea that knowledge can actually be established via proven methodologies of science, academic disciplines like history or archaeology, that are able to make very robust and testable conclusions through an actual, again, methodological ways of consistently approaching data. And instead, people sort of feel like, well, any random proposition that you might make has the same weight as any other. So gravity is just a theory. So if you come up with some other theory, of why you're sticking to the Earth, then that's just as good as something as robust as the scientific theory of gravity or of evolution. And unfortunately, many people also prefer conspiracy theories over more difficult, complex truths. And we talked about this in that session of Mormon stories that you were talking about, Book of Mormon authorship, where I was giving kind of an equation before about how kind of why people want to believe why people want extreme explanations for how the Book of Mormon was authored. And I explained how that in terms of people wanting aliens to have built the pyramids. I took that as an example of an extreme conspiracy theory. And yet, John, I think you'll remember that once we started talking about that, there were all these pyramid building conspiracy theory people who came out of the woodworks. So I've had a lot of people on my channel who are, people who are committed to that disinformation, and they just keep posting about it, right?
Yeah. And I promised you that I'm not going to be defending Michelle this whole time, and I won't be. I will say that I think today is like the first day of a academic polygamy conference that with Cheryl Bruno, Michelle Stone has organized, and they're going to be launching I think, Journal for Mormon Polygamy, and a bunch of, I think, big names are in Mormon studies are going to be attending and speaking at that conference, including Barbara Brown and Barbara Jones Brown and others. And so I'm guessing that Michelle would say this is a red herring. This idea of people not being willing to engage in academic methods, because I think Michelle and many in her movement believe they actually are different from conspiracy theorists in that they want to engage academically, and they just think the documents aren't there. Anyway, I think that's all I'm going to say about Michelle for the rest of today. Maybe.
Well, no, I mean, I applaud that path, right? So in other words, this is not even though we're talking about Michelle because you just had because she's the most prominent person who's promoting this idea.
Yeah.
I think the fact that she has gotten together with Cheryl, that they are wanting to explore this from an academic direction. The fact that she's, I think, is Todd Compton going to be at this? I can't remember. I saw the ads to this, but so certainly Todd.
I'll look it up.
Todd is an excellent historian on this topic. His book In Sacred Loneliness is amazing. I recommend that to anybody who is interested in not just the topic of Mormon polygamy, but also to get too often this is all focused on Joseph Smith and people. I think the reason why people in the Mormon community have such extreme and also ungrounded ideas about this is because everybody is so personally invested in their ideas of Joseph Smith. And what I love about Todd's book is that he takes biographies instead of all of the women and is considering their perspectives and what they have to say. And so I just think it's an amazing one. And he now has also come out with a new book on that, which is the documents behind it. And so that is so that's really, so that I think is really important. And so I think yes, we start to gather academics, what the academics can tell Michelle and other people who are interested in this idea, which I think is a faith claim idea, not a historical conclusion, is that there is a total historical consensus among the historians community that Joseph Smith is the origin of Mormon polygamy. And there's a way that you can start to do the opposite way, but it's not by going through in this apologetic method of point by point debunking little pieces of evidence haphazardly that you don't like that one, but it's instead by creating your alternative thesis, which in this case is that there's a vast, incredible conspiracy that Brigham Young has, and then show how all of the evidence supports that thesis. And unfortunately, because of the incredible amount of evidence, as we'll see, the different types of evidence, that can't be made to fit that alternate thesis. So until there is a alternate thesis, the consensus will remain. So,
all right, let's jump back to your slides.
So, going back to okay, again, until there is an academic alternative position, it's still in the realm of a conspiracy theory and disinformation. And like I say, the situation has become alarming enough that it's really difficult to use anything but even when we're using preposterous examples like aliens and the pyramids. There's a bunch of people who are alien pyramid conspiracists, and they come out of the woodwork. And if we go to the next slide, there is also the added dimension of tribalism. We're not going to get into politics on this podcast. I'll mention I'm now a Canadian. Canadians are very invested in what's going on in the U.S. right now because of the U.S. president has a lot of focus on Canada. But as a result of the kind of extreme U.S. political tribalism that's going on right now, and how different conspiracy theories and disinformation things are hooked up with that tribalism, I'm going to try to avoid throwing out analogies around about what some of the disinformation things are. That's why I'm going to stick to like aliens and the pyramids and flat eartherism, so that we can avoid some of the more contentious things.
All right.
Okay. So this is a question actually for you, John. So why do people prefer disinformation? This is not necessarily a question as much for a historian as for a psychologist, psychiatrist. So people who your fields.
Yeah. So I'm a little bit rusty, but what immediately comes to my mind is Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance management theory, that they have a worldview, they have a set of information, and they have all sorts of emotional feelings and relationships and community tied to that worldview.
Yeah.
And when they learn new information or have new experiences that are not harmonious with their knowledge base or their worldview, that difference between the new knowledge or learning or evidence or information and their worldview causes a lot of psychological and emotional distress. Yeah. And there's either two things you can do, really. You can reject the information that's being presented to you, or you can accept it and or harmonize it into your worldview. And that's the only way to resolve the dissonance. You either reject the information or you accept it and or harmonize it. That's my best immediate reaction. I'm sure I'm rusty.
Yeah, but no, I think you've got it exactly right there, right? So that's like maybe called belief perseverance or conceptual conservatism. In other words, that this is something that is not it's just human nature. It's not only happening in religions, but this is one of the things that happens in scientific advance, because even though science is all about having the best and robust tested explanation given the data that scientific inquiry is ongoing, and there's always new data, but a lot of times the last generation of scientists is invested in the hypothesis that they've had, and then they're less willing to have the revolutionary, young Turks in the science community who overturn that, and who say, well, no, wait, actually, plate tectonics is how this all works, or whatever it is. It's hard for the new theory to sometimes even break through, because we have conceptual conservatism. There's a perseverance, of this kind of belief. And I think also, in terms of some of that's if you have a let's say a pre-existing faith claim that you're kind of now finding new information about, or seeing information that debunks it, and then you reject that. But then there's also in terms of disinformation addiction as a broader thing, embracing of conspiracy theories. I think there's also a social component of it's psychologically exciting that you are part of the in-group. You know something that everybody else doesn't know. I think that's actually always been an exciting part of the Latter-day Saint movement. When we are claiming that we're the one and only true church, well, then we have some additional knowledge that all these other Christians, they don't get. They're not the true Christians. They don't understand the real thing. We've got the secret special sauce that they don't have, and so you can be very happy about that. And that can be, that's, for, let's say, the aliens and the, knowing that you're the one who knows that the aliens came and built the pyramids, that you're part of a select group that knows more than, than everybody else. And so we talked about this in the, if you got the slide, we talked about this in the Book of Mormon authorship one, where I said essentially, in part, this is also then can be this kind of a conspiracy about the aliens building the pyramids. Can also be based on a kind of a false equation that people build up in their minds when they think, well, these pyramids are really big and they're hard to build, and it's somehow there's a coincidence that there are pyramids in Egypt and there's also pyramids in Guatemala. Two, it's impossible for ancient people to have the engineering expertise to build big stone objects like pyramids, and it's impossible for ancient workers to have the capacity to build things with big stones. And so people provide an extra needed component, which is alien intervention, because aliens can do anything, that would allow for that equation to be fixed in their mind. But actually, if we find out, what archaeology tells us, what studies of the pyramids tell us, and so forth, making a pyramid is simpler than you think in terms of an engineering standpoint. The engineers of the Egyptians actually had a lot more know-how than people sometimes might think offhand. And it turns out that ancient people were pretty good at dragging around big rocks. And so what I try to say in that equation, I said in the last series that we did on Book of Mormon authorships, that therefore the idea of extreme explanations are not necessary. Aliens aren't needed to solve that equation.
All right. I love that graphic.
Well, I thought we'd revisit it. In some ways, I want to build on that previous series we did. So, but in doing this thing, in having this, embracing this particular conspiracy, I'm just using this as emblematic of all of these. The conspiracy theorist is rejecting just a whole wealth of expertise. So archaeology, linguistics, the academic discipline of history, Egypt has been extensively studied now for the past 2 centuries, and Egyptologists, historians, archaeologists have mapped out Egypt's history going all the way back to the 5th millennium BC. And so even though there had been all of these exotic ideas of this lost civilization that we knew very little about prior to the 1820s, when Jean-Francois Champollion deciphered hieroglyphics, that's really far in the rearview mirror. We now have, as much as you want to know about Egypt as you want to know. So, for example, if you go to the next slide, the entire set of all of the dynasties, going all the way back to 3000 BC, we are able to date them with a lot of amazing detail. I mean, there'll be some things that aren't known within a year or two, and some of the, we can't know, there's only so much that the records tell us. But for a civilization, Egypt is rare because so much was written down and so much is able to survive in the environment of Egypt. And so, expertise actually does give us all kinds of knowledge of ancient Egypt, whereas people who want to, if we go to the next slide, embrace, alien astronaut conspiracy theories, it also requires just this incredible ignorance that we now know of the distance and impracticability of travel, even to the nearest stars. So back when I was a little kid and Star Trek was on, it was pretty easy to do a science fiction fantasy where you get in a ship and you beam up and you go really fast to things. But if we warp speed or hyperspace or something like that, but the incredible distances involved and without having the magic of warp space, speed, or hyperspace, means that it's just travel between the stars is is a much bigger thing than anything we've done. So for us to send a ship to some even very close by planet, just so that we can lurk around in the distance and not contact the inhabitants that are around for thousands of years, or whatever the aliens are doing, it requires more than the combined output of everything we've ever done, as humans and built, in order to just build the interstellar craft to get us there to do this nonsense thing. So in any event, this is an example of, just because you have an idea, it doesn't mean it's the same as any other idea. There are reasons why ideas that are built up through deep study, through methodology, are actually can be said to be completely of a different order than just an idea that somebody has, because they say, well, it's impossible for somebody to have built that thing, or how can we explain that there are pyramids in both places, or any of those kind of things. So.
Got it. Okay.
So if we continue on this path to the next one, when I was a teenager, my grandpa Hamer told me that he believed that Black people and other non-white people did evolve from apes, in other words, he believed in evolution, except for when it comes to white people. So he believed, and I don't know where he got this crazy idea, but anyway, he believed that white people were colonists from Mars. And so this is not an unusual idea in science fiction. So humans are not creatures of Earth in works like Battlestar Galactica, if you remember. So the people are from out there, life began out there. Larry Niven's universe, Earth people are from the humans are from a different planet. They're from the Pack planet. In Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the humans are descended from people from a different planet, and so forth. There is evolution, but not for humans. Humans are a completely different order of thing. And so, in my grandfather's case, I will say that, well, I'll talk about why he'd believe that. Let's go to the next one. So it's not an uncommon fantasy. So, if you ever watched Battlestar Galactica like I did as a kid, as a Mormon kid, this was a Mormon, the creator of the show was Mormon, and there are those who believe that life here began out there far across the universe with tribes of humans that may have been the forefathers of the Egyptians, the Toltecs, the Mayans. I think this was actually not that far off from my mom's view of Mormonism too, because God is potentially off on the planet like Kolob. The Earth is not. The Earth is a relatively new creation. It has these fossils not because of evolution, but because God had used pieces of other planets and put it together to build the Earth and things like that. And that Adam, comes directly. There may have been life evolving because God created it that way, but Adam is coming directly from Kolob or whatever. So it may well be that, and so the things like Battlestar Galactica, things like Mormon theology, may also have influenced some of those things. Except if we go to the next slide, except that it didn't happen. So the narrative, exciting as that may be, that humans are of a completely different order of being than all other Earth life, that's absolutely false. So we know from the science of biology, the science of genetics, that, for example, we share 98% plus of our DNA with our closest cousins, chimpanzees. All humans, including my white grandpa, are evolved from Earth animals, despite, his kind of faith claim to the contrary. And so if we go to the next one, the DNA evidence is conclusive. This Battlestar Galactica thesis, is false. And so why, I ask then, why do you hold beliefs in contradiction to evidence? Even though, the evidence, even though these beliefs have been proved false by, like I say, rigorous scientific evidence, established academic methodologies, you've already given one of the examples. Another example is, like you say, people have these pre-existing commitments, and then they experience dissonance when they find new evidence, or when they're given new evidence that doesn't go up with that. And like I say, it's not limited to religion. It can happen with everything. So part of our identity myth for almost everybody is we have nationalism as part of our mythos. So the movie Braveheart. It's a fun movie. People like it and all that kind of thing. It's terrible history. And I had a friend who was from Scotland, who's not a historian, but who, didn't like the English. It's not uncommon for Scottish people to not like the English. And he watched Braveheart, and he considered that to be every bit of it to be historic and every bit of it to be true. And so he had whole new reasons to hate the English now because of prima nocta, which is this this thing that's presented in Braveheart, where English lords had the right or exercised the right of being allowed to deflower Scottish maidens on their wedding night. It's completely false. That never happened. This is not a thing. But it becomes part of your national myth or your national identity. You hold to it, when these national myths are created. So,
all right. Sorry, Mel Gibson.
Sorry, he deserves it. All right. So let's go to religious propositions. So flat eartherism is the other example I'm going to use. So it's on the rise again. It's a general secular conspiracy theory, and there are flat earthers around in a society. But it was actually popularized in the modern era as a religious tenet, and it was promoted in the 20th century by a guy named Wilbur Glenn Voliva, who was the general overseer of the Christian Catholic Apostolic Church. Have you heard of them?
I don't. Unless it's like a niche subgroup. I've never heard of them.
Yeah, so it was actually a pretty big church. It was very popular. It grew very popularly at the end of the 19th century, and Voliva was in charge of it in the early 20th century. So if you go to the next slide, I can show you this. So this is a picture of the tabernacle in the city of Zion, Illinois. And you can kind of see just how huge this is. And it's just filled with the followers, members of the Christian Catholic Apostolic Church. By the way, it's not Catholic. It has nothing to do with Catholics. They're just using the word Catholic, which means universal. So it's a Protestant or a new church, a new religious tradition, like the Latter-day Saint tradition. Founded in Illinois here, or organized or headquartered in Illinois. And it's actually kind of amazing that this town that this group built, Zion, Illinois, you may have never heard of it. I've been there. It's a little north of Chicago. It has this vast plat, and it is centered on a huge temple lot where this tabernacle was built. And if you go to the next slide, you can see the plat of the city of Zion, Illinois. And so it's kind of an interesting, I think it's interesting for people in the Restoration tradition, because we think of how big and impressive Nauvoo was, but this town actually got built out, and it had huge industries. And so it's a very significant footprint, although the church is largely doesn't exist anymore. There's a small little remnant of it left.
Let me just really quickly share a comment from a viewer and a listener. Blowfish writes, John Hamer, I love your well-rounded explanations. Thank you for your work. Thank you for being on Mormon Stories. I agree. I'll just also remind everybody, it would be fantastic if you could subscribe to this podcast, to this YouTube channel on Spotify as well. If you can like this episode and comment on this episode and share this episode, that helps with engagement, and it'll make YouTube more likely to share it. And I'll also add, while you're subscribing to Mormon Stories podcast, please subscribe to Center Place YouTube channel. That's Center with the TRE-place. And you can find hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of John Hamer's educational courses, and largely religious educational courses that he presents, I think, every Sunday from Center Place. Anyway, back to you, John Hamer.
Well, thank you. Yes, and thanks for that comment. I appreciate that a lot. So yeah, just going back to this group, Voliva, like I say, it is the guy who popularized in modern times the flat Earth theory. And so he published ads. He would take up big ads in Scientific American. He would challenge anybody who could to prove, offer proof that the Earth was round, and he would, offer these big rewards. But of course, it was never possible to prove anything to Voliva, because he rejected all established scientific methodologies. And so, he dismissed actual proofs and religiously held his belief in a flat Earth, this what we talked about here as belief perseverance. And so if we go to the next one, as many listeners of Mormon stories, I think, know well from personal experience, if they left, let's say they left the Mormon Church, and then they want to get their wife out or their husband out, or they want to tell friends and loved ones or something, they may want to, like, their natural tendency is to want to, like, give a whole bunch of evidence and just hit them up with all these things, evidence that disproves historically or some other way, literary criticism of the Book of Mormon to show that it's not an ancient document, and it turns out that offering that kind of proof is really ineffective, right? So as we've talked about, belief perseverance in the face of new information is just this natural trait. And so just giving the CES letter to somebody, sometimes that works, but it often or usually doesn't. And it can lead to, the person, it backfiring. So for example, when my dad, who left the Mormon Church when I was in my 20s, after I'd left, he then wrote a whole bunch of essays to my mom, trying to get her to leave the Mormon Church. And she, didn't believe any of those, wasn't interested in any of that kind of stuff. If anything, like I say, it backfired and made her more committed. And ultimately they went on and on for that, but for a long time. And so ultimately, my mom made this deal with him. He could spend an entire year telling her all of the proofs that he could ever think of, and he would present them formally, and she would listen to every single one of them. And then after that year, he couldn't ever talk to her about it ever again. And so she did that, and she's lived happily ever after.
That's awesome.
So another thing that we talked about in the Book of Mormon authorship one is this idea of the Solomon Spaulding theory, right? And so there's a new revival of the Spaulding theory through a book by Lars Nielsen. Lars is also a really nice guy. I was able to meet with him at Sunstone last year.
He's also the brother of David Nielsen, who's known as the whistleblower for Ensign Peak. And it was actually Lars who was the original whistleblower, in the sense that what's understood publicly is that Lars worked with David Nielsen to file the whistleblower complaint with the IRS. But then Lars shared that news publicly. Okay. And did you know Lars and Dave are brothers?
I didn't know that. No, I hadn't known.
They're actually, I think they're identical twins.
Oh, okay.
Just a little factoid. Anyway, shout out to Lars, super smart guy.
Yeah. And when I read his book, I could tell within a chapter or so, this guy is a very smart person who is almost certainly a physical scientist who has no training in history.
I think he has a chemistry PhD from Harvard, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to say I didn't have to look it up to know that, because I could just tell from reading it. so unfortunately, so what I would say about his book is that at a certain point he came up with he found in reading about Athanasius Kircher, who is a interesting figure, a 17th century polymath. Athanasius Kircher is interesting because before Champollion, before hieroglyphics were legitimately deciphered, he had a phony decipherment of Egyptian. And his idea that he promoted and that everybody believed in early modern Europe was that these fantastic pictures of the hieroglyphs, that these were ideograms, that they encapsulated whole sentences and things like that. That they were not simply little glyph characters, but there was like almost a magic language that the ancient Egyptians had. And so Kircher, in his phony or false decipherment of Egyptian, he relied upon, he said, a certain rabbi named Nephi. And so that's just a very interesting coincidence, and I agree with Lars that that's an interesting coincidence. But based on that one coincidence, he then draws a whole bunch of, additional things that he thinks are Kircherian Kircherian parallels, where he thinks that somehow Kircher is a source for the Book of Mormon, and that somehow, even though there's no direct evidence of it, that Solomon Spaulding had access to Kircher's work, and that somehow emphasizes or somehow buttresses the Spaulding theory, which it doesn't really. When unfortunately, I think it's pretty clear that the name Nephi is not coming through this very obscure channel, a book that wasn't available to Spaulding or Joseph Smith in English in the time frame. When the name Nephi is available, the King James version of the book of Second Maccabees, in chapter 1, verse 36, talks about Nephi, and it talks about it uses the word Nephi in a passage that's talking essentially about something magical, something that would appeal to Joseph Smith, I think. And so I think that we can say pretty clearly that the source of the name Nephi is not Kircher's work, but it's actually the Bible. And that also then, one of the things that I'm sorry to say that Lars's work, fails to describe, again, this idea that Kircher does have an influence on Joseph Smith for sure, not via Solomon Spaulding. That's nothing to do with Solomon Spaulding. Joseph Smith's Egyptian grammar relies on Kircherian understanding of Egyptian, and so Joseph Smith is working with the papyruses, with all his scribes, and they're trying to get a decipherment of how the Egyptian language and grammar work. And he uses each little glyph, and he translates them as having a whole paragraph, because he has this Kircherian idea of how Egyptian works. And it's not because he has access to Kircher's work, it's because Kircher has been so influential that idea has percolated throughout all of society up until that time. And so he's using that Kircherian idea of that. And I talked about this long before Lars was looking into this, back when I did a paper on the decipherment of the Strang plates, that Joseph Smith is using this Kircherian idea of hieroglyphs even without knowing it. So in any event, I wanted to mention that as an aside. That's kind of an aside here too. But as we're talking about, I want to talk about more seriously, why do Exmos continue to do the same thing that I was accusing conspiracy theories about? So if we go to this, why do Exmos, whose identity is actually often based on the claim that the whole reason they left Mormonism is because they were presented with evidence that disproved its truth claims. So they had believed the Book of Mormon was history. They read the C.S. letter. They were persuaded by all of those arguments. And yet, nevertheless, then they immediately fall into this belief that Solomon Spaulding is the Book of Mormon's author, despite there is an absolute academic consensus to the contrary. And I'm going to argue here that this is also an example of belief perseverance. So we had this other equation. You go to the next slide. We had this other equation in the Book of Mormon authorship slide, which it gets quoted a lot on Reddit, which is that that people who are Mormon and then even ex-Mormon, they continue to believe this Mormon faith claim that as a 270,000 some word long book, the Book of Mormon was super hard to write. Joseph Smith is supposedly this completely uneducated person who can barely write at the age of 23. It's composed in this incredibly short amount of time. And so therefore you need to have something else to explain how, it could possibly have been written, even after ex-Mormons have rejected the idea that it's actually translating an ancient document or done supernaturally. They still want to have some other extreme explanation. And so, and if we go to the next slide, we argued in the Book of Mormon authorship series that actually, no, the composition of a book is much less a big deal than it sometimes seems like it is, that the Book of Mormon is very writable. Joseph Smith is much smarter and more knowledgeable than he's often made out to be in this stage of his life by church apologetics. And indeed, he continues to write texts like this. So I talked about the Egyptian grammar and the writing that he does in things like the Book of Abraham, Moses, the Bible, Joseph Smith translation, and so forth. we've tested it out, and the time frame for the composing the text is doable, and so therefore these kinds of extreme explanations are unnecessary. So there are lots of ex-Mormons like your friend and mine, Randy Snyder, who recently passed away. I met him. When I met him, he was a proponent of the Spaulding theory, and he actually invited me onto his podcast, Infants on Thrones, because he had invited Craig Criddle, who had done, not a historian, but who had done a computer word print analysis, which was reviving the Spaulding theory for a bunch of people. And so he wanted me to talk about why historians like me reject Spaulding authorship. And so I just feel like, so I've been involved in that particular one of these disinformation addictions or conspiracy theories, the Spaulding theory, for this whole time too. But fortunately, lots of people like my friend Randy, or your friend and mine, Randy, are actually, even though he was initially holding on to some of those kind of faith claims that Joseph Smith was too uneducated, that the Book of Mormon is such a great thing, but then he later was open to all of the evidence, competing evidence to this, that shows how the Book of Mormon on so many pages has Joseph Smith's fingerprints all around it, how it's so completely referencing things in his life, how it's fit to his own time, and so forth, that that people can then ditch the conspiracy theories and accept the historical reality like he did.
Yeah, and shout out to our dear late friend Randy Snyder. We love you, Randy, and we miss you, brother.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I want to say then about this topic is historians, regardless of affiliation, so non-Mormons, loyalist LDS people, liberal Mormons, ex-Mormons, Community of Christ historians, everybody's weighed the evidence, and universally historians conclude Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy is the origin. There are details that can be argued about here and there, but this idea that there was some kind of Brigham Young conspiracy and Brigham Young was the originator of it and Joseph Smith was fighting it the whole time is not a thesis that any academic has found to be persuasive. And if we go to the next one, that's because of just the enormous weight of the evidence. So we just, unlike, I'm trained primarily as an ancient and a medieval historian, and there's precious little evidence we have from antiquity and the Middle Ages. You have pretty much, you're lucky if we have, a couple sources. Otherwise, we have one source, and we have to read that source for its biases and so forth. We have to decide, well, we can't trust Josephus here for this reason, but we don't have any other sources to check him, and so therefore this is what we have, what we're stuck with. That is not the case for Joseph Smith, who is alive in modern times, who made a lot of. He was a scandal of his era. So there were people who were observing him who were not members of the church. He has a movement. He's writing all kinds of things while he's alive. He has a movement that continues on. He has people who dissent from him during his lifetime and write exposés. He has people who are loyal to him who are busy writing journals. He has people in the movement that splits apart who have competing loyalties after he's gone. And so we just have this incredible amount of evidence, and it's ratcheted up to times 10 because of this decision that Joseph Smith III, the prophet of the reorganized church, made to try to rehabilitate his father's reputation and claim that his father Joseph Smith Jr. had never practiced polygamy. And so as a result, people wrote down more evidence and more plainly than they ever would have, and swore out affidavits than they ever would have in a Victorian era, where many of the wives explained in their testimonies that not only were they sealed to the prophet and lived as his wife in every sense, they'll say, so that they are more forthcoming about that than they otherwise would have been.
All right. So
So yeah, if we go through these the next couple, so in addition to this kind of this kind of evidence, both in Joseph's life and after, that includes evidence from insiders who remain loyal to Joseph Smith throughout his life, and then who afterwards, including Brigham Young, but also all of Brigham Young's followers, so who remained loyal to Brigham Young after 1860. And the next one, that also includes evidence of insiders who were loyal to Joseph Smith in their life and stayed loyal to the movement, but then followed Joseph Smith III after 1860. We have, and by the way, despite the fact that Joseph Smith III was arguing that his father was not a polygamist, there are many of the RLDS leaders who knew better, people like William Marks, who were saying, who were upset with Joseph III for making statements that they know to be false. There are then insiders who were loyal to Joseph Smith during his life, but who then went and were in factions where they opposed Brigham Young and opposed Joseph Smith III. And so, we have people that are, continue to be Strangites, who continue to testify to Joseph Smith's polygamy. We have all of these other church groups in the Latter-day Saint tradition that are non-Brighamite, non-Josephite, and yet still trace their origins to Joseph Smith and the polygamy there. And then finally, we have insiders who break with Joseph Smith and leave the movement. People as infamous as John C. Bennett, but as also, I think, as admirable as William Law. And in all of these cases, these are people, insiders with information about this, who all of these together speak essentially in one chorus, that Joseph Smith is the origin of polygamy. And there's no reason for these people who are just hate Brigham Young and are Brigham Young's enemies to hide the fact that that's actually a conspiracy created by Brigham Young. You can see why the people who are loyalists to Brigham Young might do that, but it just can't be used to explain this evidence. And so really what I'm trying to say here is, because of the incredible weight of the evidence, it's actually a much easier ask to imagine the Spaulding conspiracy theory, where it only requires, that Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery are in with Joseph Smith on a conspiracy theory to hide the fact that Solomon Spaulding is the true author, and that maybe probably B. Pratt, or maybe the Whitmers are maybe involved in that too, or David Whitmer at least. In other words, it's a pretty limited conspiracy theory, even though it's rejected by historical consensus. For a Brigham Young as the origin of polygamy conspiracy theory, it's just hundreds of conspirators, that needing to maintain the lie that it was Joseph Smith and not Brigham Young. Even though the fact that they're horrible rivals of Brigham Young. I wrote this essay called the Spaulding Fable, which talked about Sidney Rigdon taking the truth that he had been, the mastermind behind the whole Book of Mormon plot, how he took it to his grave, because the last thing he'd want to have at the end of his life, when he died alone and a pauper without any followers, is that last thing he'd want was credit. And this is also true, I think, for all of Brigham Young's rivals, or frankly, even within his movement, all these people who didn't like him, that for them to all keep their silence. So it's crazy.
All right.
So therefore, Joseph Smith, polygamy denialism, requires not only then this wholesale of rejection of history as an academic discipline. Ultimately, we'll see the attempts to embrace it can only lead, in my opinion, to the historical consensus, which is what I've just established. So people will reject it. The more proponents of polygamy denialism become academic, then they will themselves reject their truth claim that they have right now. It also then requires, like I say, believing in conspiracy that just extends far beyond credibility. And so it's not just even the Spaulding theory territory, but I think it's closer to flat eartherism and the pyramids. And so anyway, why are so many Mormons without this training in academic history, then kind of warming up to this theory. And so I'm going to say ultimately it's because people just have this, just love and also unrealistic vision in their hearts about Joseph Smith. These include just wonderful people who are, really nice and everything, but they just, people get these emotional perspectives about Joseph Smith, and many of these portraits that people paint in their hearts are not going to be true in terms of historicity if you have the actual exposure to the evidence. And so I think that, when I was saying that at the Spaulding theory, at its heart, these are ex-Mos who believe that Joseph Smith was just too dumb or illiterate or whatever to write such an incredible book. People also don't want to believe that Joseph Smith did this just, embarrassing, foolish, obnoxious, abusive thing that he did, which was establish polygamy in secret, among his followers. And, if we hadn't done it, it would be great for all of us. We wouldn't have the central controversy, the central crisis, the central scandal, the sine qua non of Mormon history. It's what Mormon history became, ultimately about. It's what we're living in that wake now.
Julie's asking the name of that essay that you wrote about Sidney Rigdon. Was it an essay?
Oh yeah. It's called The Spaulding Fable.
Oh,
and
Solomon
it's
Spaulding.
one of the
Solomon Spaulding. Okay.
Yeah, and so it's it was a blog post on By Common Consent. It's an old, it's still going, a Mormon group blog that I was a blogger on, and that has got to be one of my most quoted things I've ever written. People go back to the Spaulding Fable essay. What I'm trying to show there is what I was trying to show in that essay. It's not an academic essay. It's a dramatization of what you have to believe in the Spaulding conspiracy theory. And so that's the idea of it. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Spaulding Fable. We'll make sure and share that in the show notes. Thanks, John.
Yeah. So one of the other pictures that people have, they have this picture of Joseph Smith. So Joseph Smith, in addition to teaching the principle of plural marriage to his inner circle of friends, to women and girls he was getting sealed to in Nauvoo, he also had a policy of what we sometimes call, I think in Mormonism, lying for the Lord. And so that is that he had a church-wide policy of denying the practice in public. And he did that, he justified that in order to avoid external persecution. He said that the church should be, destroyed if people found out about it, which sort of true, and also to suppress internal dissent. So lots of people like William Law would have revolted, people in the branches would have revolted, people in converts in England would certainly have thought twice about going to the Americas once they learned about it. And so this policy of lying about polygamy continued to be LDS church policy. So Brigham Young takes control of that headquarters apparatus after Joseph Smith's death, and he maintains that until 1852. So even though everybody is living it very scandalously out in Utah, and it's a very, very open secret, it is still church policy all the way up until 1852 to lie about polygamy in Utah. And so actually when they change the policy and they say, oh, yeah, we actually are living it, then that news goes all the way out to Europe where some of the missionaries, some of the apostles are. They had just barely been publishing all these denials about the polygamy. And then suddenly that's overturned and they say, oh, haha, so sorry, our bad. I guess we're going to tell the truth about this now. So that had been the policy. And what people somehow can't ever get which I don't understand, but anyway, when they look at Emma, and all of the things that Joseph Smith's legal wife, Emma, went through, and they wonder how could Emma apparently, in her last interview with her son, Joseph III, who had made it his lifelong position to try to clear his father's name and deny that his father had anything to do with polygamy, how could she have affirmed that what her son's policy was and lied about polygamy when she knew otherwise? And the answer, I think, is that is the church's policy. That was the church's policy under Joseph Jr. It continues to be the church's policy in the RLDS church. And it's the policy when she is giving that interview. And there is no reason that just because Brigham Young changes a policy that somehow that would cause the policy to change in the RLDS church.
Got it. Okay. And you also mentioned on the slide that, as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the LDS Church maintained the position that Joseph never practiced polygamy until the 1980s.
Yeah, and then when it started to say, well, we not know, and then, like I said, after that, like I said, in the 2000s, it finally came up with a position that we don't have a policy, or we don't take a position on it, and then it was only in 2010 that a book was actually published that admitted it. So,
got it.
All right. So let's talk about lying for the Lord. So, didn't always follow this, but Joseph Smith certainly had this view of perjury where he feels like he's not really lying if he can say something that's technically the truth, even if he's saying it with the intent to deceive people in his audience. And so, for example, he would always openly condemn things like the spiritual wifery, or he would say polygamy is wrong and polygamy is of the devil. And he wouldn't explain that in public. He'd say those kind of blanket pronouncements in public, but privately, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, he would teach that polygamy or spiritual wifery are Satan's counterfeit of God's true principle of celestial marriage, of plural marriage. But he doesn't tell people publicly that's what he means. What he means publicly, could people just think that he's making a blanket condemnation of polygamy in general, not that he is also making an exception for celestial marriage, for plural marriage, the secret thing that he's teaching. And so Paul, in one of the letters, the Apostle Paul, talks about teaching new people and giving them milk before meat. And so this is one of the justifications that gets quoted by Mormon leaders about the practice of lying for the Lord.
Got it.
And so an example would be after William Law had published that expose that I talked about of plural marriage.
And really quickly, let people know how high up William Law was in the organizational structure of the church. He wasn't just some lay member, right?
No. William Law is he had been adopted into the first presidency, right? So he is a member of, he's not one of the two counselors, but he's a special counselor in the first presidency. The original first presidency often had those. He was also one of the richest people in Nauvoo. So William Law was a convert from here in Canada. He moved to Nauvoo with a lot of money, and he was able to, for example, open a big store. He was able to open a big mill. And so he was one of the people who were invested heavily in the town. And a lot of times when you have that kind of those kind of resources and with that kind of a leader as well, then Joseph would co-opt you. And so they were close associates before William was told about plural marriage by Joseph and rejected it, and then caused his expose to be published in the Nauvoo Expositor. So
really quickly, Julia's saying it's her understanding that Emma used to tell people to only listen to Joseph from the stand, which to Julia suggests that she knew that he would say different things behind closed doors. I don't know if you can confirm that, but Julia's usually spot on.
Yeah. So this would be, so Emma is an opponent of polygamy, so, with the brief exception of when she wasn't and when she accepted it in secret for a brief time in Nauvoo, and in circumstances under which she was continuously being lied to by Joseph. So the practice was much larger and more extensive than Emma knew. Joseph was secretly marrying her friends, counselors in the Relief Society, and so forth. And it was only really with the dictation of the manuscript that was later canonized in the LDS Church's DNC 132 that where she's threatened with destruction by the Lord if she doesn't accept it. That she temporarily accepts it, and when that happens, even and she agrees to pick a couple girls for Joseph to be sealed to, he's actually already sealed to them, and those women later testify that they had already been married, but they go through the sealing again for the benefit of Emma, who is being deceived, right? And so Emma doesn't like the secret teachings that Joseph Smith is doing. So it might be a thing that she's saying, listen from the pulpit. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So one of the things he says from the pulpit or to a crowd is, he says this new holy prophet, William Law. So William Law has published the Expositor and has founded the Reformed Mormon Church. He's gone to Carthage, the county seat that Nauvoo is in the county in Illinois, Hancock County, and sworn that I have told him that I told him that I was guilty of adultery. This spiritual wifism, why a man dares not speak or wink, for fear of being accused of this. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives, when I can only find one. So maybe he's looking around, in the crowd, and he's not, he's like, I'm accused of having these wives, but if I look around, I'm only seeing one wife, and that kind of a thing. So he's trying to say, I'm opposed to spiritual wifism, no matter what all these people said. So privately, he, though, is teaching people the principle of celestial or plural marriage, and publicly, he's denouncing spiritual wifism. And so I mentioned this in terms of lying for the Lord. This wink that he's giving is maybe like the wink, if people remember, when LDS President Gordon Hinckley, I think we went on Larry King and said that he doesn't know much about the idea of the plan of salvation, but essentially about becoming gods and something like that. Mormons becoming gods and having their own planets. We don't know much about that. I don't know if we teach that kind of thing. Whatever he said to Larry King, and then he came back to General Conference and he says, "I know plenty about that," or something. Whatever he said, right? You probably remember the quote better than I do.
Yeah, he basically said, "You don't need to worry that I understand, Mormon doctrine. I understand it great." And everybody laughed. Yeah. Everybody knew what he was talking about.
Right.
But he was basically just reassuring the membership that they could hold on to their ultra-Orthodox views that men can become gods when, because of the movie The God Makers, it was embarrassing to the church that the world was making it known that Mormons had this extreme belief by the view of many Christians that they could become gods. And so the church, and it was affecting the church's relationship with other Christian churches. So the church wanted its cake and eat it too. Hinckley wanted to tell the world to downplay and dismiss the Mormon belief that Mormons could become gods, but didn't want to lose membership over it. So he spoke out of both sides of his mouth, basically.
Yeah. And I guess what I would argue is that that's a example of lying for the Lord, right?
Yeah. So
he goes in the public, he says something that is, he didn't necessarily entirely perjure himself, but he's meaning to deceive, right? So his goal is to get people to not think that, or publicly. And then he comes back in private and says to the members, "Oh, I know plenty about that," that kind of thing, right? So it's a, kind of lying for the Lord. And that's also, this is the policy that Joseph F. Smith has when during in the early 20th century, when they're trying to seat Utah's first senator, the Smoot hearings, and he comes and he testifies, and he and other church leaders testify before the Senate committee, and they're sworn in and so forth. And he begins by saying these kind of duplicitous statements where he is essentially lying for the Lord. He's perjuring himself, but by saying things that are kind of inherently, they're not false, but they're meant to deceive. But then he's never had to experience before a thing where he gets follow-up questions. So the senators are saying, "Well, do you mean this by that?" And so then he has to actually expose the truth under oath. And so the truth that they haven't really been given, they hadn't really given up polygamy when they needed, were supposed to have, So
another example, interestingly, of Gordon B. Hinckley lying for the Lord is when he was asked by Larry King if Mormons still practice polygamy, and he said it's no longer doctrinal, which isn't true. Because it's in the Doctrine and Covenants 132. It has not been decanonized.
Right.
And we know that 2 of the 3 members of the First Presidency today are in celestial plural marriages.
Right.
So he was trying to say to the world, we don't believe in polygamy anymore.
Right.
When he knows that it's still doctrinal, and what he was trying to skate that technicality by meaning to say it's no, we no longer practice it in marriages of living people today. But to me, that was also dissembling or lying for the Lord, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good example too. Yeah, so they've been trying to, certainly since Heber J. Grant, they've been trying to get polygamy out of the story, right? They don't want polygamy to be part of the story anymore. We now have really given it up and we're done.
Yeah.
So if we go to the next slide, this is kind of like a lying for the Lord about polygamy timeline. And so the early church, this is the policy. So in the orange here, in the 1840s, Joseph Smith wants himself, he does, and all of his followers are meant to lie about the practice of celestial or plural marriage, that it is happening, but out loud you don't say it. And that changes, in the tradition that follows up Brigham Young in 1852, when then Brigham Young changes that policy. So there's that purple line there where that goes from there until the first manifesto, where the LDS Mormons are openly practicing polygamy again and admitting it against Joseph Smith's policy, which was to lie about it. Then what happened after the first manifesto, what is now called Official Declaration 1 in the LDS D&C, Mormons promised that they were going to give it up. But they only did that to try to get statehood, and they thought the world was going to end, and so they figured Wilford Woodruff figured he can run out the clock until the world ended, and so they go back to the policy of lying about it while still secretly practicing it. But then, like I mentioned, with that the Smoot hearings and the other scandals, as Americans were upset that they had been lied to, the church publishes a second manifesto telling people, no, we are going to stop it now. And ultimately, there's a third and final manifesto after which they get rid of apostles who are still secretly doing it and that kind of thing. And that causes the schism with the fundamentalist Mormons ultimately. But essentially, that's the LDS path where, there's this policy, and it's actually done, there's two periods of it where polygamy is being practiced, and it's being practiced and denied publicly. In the Strangite Church, James Strang comes out as a polygamist earlier, so in 1849. And so then the Strangite Mormons are openly able to be polygamist, although they're doing it substantially less percentage of the members are polygamists than in Utah. But then Strang is himself martyred, and the practice dies out among the Strangites. And like I said, in the RLDS Church, if we look at the timeline again, Emma has no reason to follow Brigham Young's policy change. She's not taking her orders from Brigham Young. So in any event, there is never a reversal of this. Joseph III initially would himself like to believe that he has a vision of his father. He doesn't want to believe it. I think that ultimately he has been given sufficient evidence that he knows better by the end, but is deciding that he's going to ride it out. His brother, David Hiram Smith, who has been a missionary in Utah, who has been given sufficient evidence that his faith in his father's innocence has been shattered, and there's a wonderful biography of him called "From Mission to Madness." He ultimately, has a mental breakdown. Whether or not that has anything to do with this dissonance that happens, can't say. But anyway, in any event, that's where they're at. And again, all of the other early leaders, William Marks, others are very in the RLDS movement who had any association or intimate association with Joseph Smith. They tell Joseph III that he's wrong, and Joseph III simply waits them out until they're all dead, and then he continues to insist. So,
all right, that's a great timeline.
All right, so about the modern conspiracy theory. So yeah, RLDS people believed that as a matter of faith, but Mormons obviously didn't. It's only been recently that people in the LDS tradition now have started to not believe that Joseph Smith is the origin of Mormon polygamy as a faith claim. And it's actually shocking whenever I tell to RLDS people that this is the position that has happened. They can't believe that this has changed. They say, how could that possibly be the case? Because they're used to the arguing with the other way around Mormons about this. But anyway, so I became aware of this back when Rock Waterman published something about it, and on a chat board, in the 2000s some point. And I kind of, because I've been so used to hearing these from our LDS conservatives, that I kind of immediately wrote a kind of a mean essay back to Rock. And he was very, he was what I'm trying to say, he was very polite and not, even though I had been very aggressive in my response to this idea, I kind of feel like, or I kind of maybe even overdid it. He was very effusive and kind of said, well, I'm not a historian. I was just saying things that I thought was an interesting idea that I like as an idea, and so forth. And so it wasn't a real fight or anything like that, but that's kind of where I became, aware of this. And so, I don't know if Rock Waterman is ever, I don't know the details of if he became a part of the remnant movement or the.
I think he did, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. So this remnant movement, Denver Snuffer Jr. has sort of been the inspiration behind it. Have embraced old RLDS apologetics, and they've read, for example, the 1970s book Joseph Fought Polygamy. It's an RLDS people who are Richard Price, the Prices that left the RLDS Church over RLDS historians becoming academically trained and actually doing academic studies of history. He didn't like that and went back to old faith claims that are not based on academic history. So, and they published that, and that's been the thing that has influenced this conspiracy theory in modern Utah Mormonism, or this sort of people who are a little bit estranged from the Utah Church's organization and structure. And so, I wanted to say, if we go to the next one, I'm actually very sympathetic to the idea. Within this shared Latter-day Saint tradition, this is my ethnic heritage. For people who want to reclaim spiritual practices, they want to get rid of correlation and corporate leadership that controls so much in the Utah Church sphere. But for me, I think it's a real mistake to build their new movements on truth claims that have been conclusively shown to be false by academic disciplines. So I don't think that this is the path that you should go in. And we have, as an example of what happened in the RLDS Church. So go to the next slide. So I want to say, this is the failure of Joseph Smith III's church. So Joseph III came to power with like an incredible, he got ordained to be the head of a new organization at a moment when, the Latter-day Saint people in the Midwest were all scattered. He immediately was able to gather them all in from the different defunct movements that had existed, the Strangites and others, and brought a whole bunch of new enthusiasm and really rebuilt a movement. And there was a lot of enthusiasm in Utah as well. Brigham Young, as he aged, had become, a lot of ways a tyrant. He had control financially and everything else over so much. He was, there was lots of opposition. There were lots of people who were remembering, the time under Joseph Smith, and maybe would have been happy to recapture that. But Joseph Smith III, rather than seeing his duty as being to our people, as to the movement, and trying to help people who were part of what I think of as Brigham Young's tyranny, if he couldn't welcome them in because he was so much more interested in stamping out or defending his father's reputation from this thing that his father actually had done. And so if he had been able to have some kind of a different, if he'd had a different response that would have been inclusive of Latter-day Saint people in Utah whose lives and families were totally intertwined with this practice of polygamy, even if they maybe would like to have started to get rid of it, if he could have done that in a phased way, it would have been completely, the whole of our history would have been completely different. And I just want to have like that from the picture. I have this thing, the story of the wedge. So I was raised LDS, as I was saying. Nothing I hated worse than the General Conference. I found it to be so boring. I never understood, this was a kid, but anyway, I never understood, how Mormons are really, all get excited about conference weekend and all this kind of thing. I'm like, what? Why? That was the part I did not like in this church. I was not interested in all these old guys. Out of all of the different conferences I was ever having to go with, there's only one story I remember, and maybe the listeners here will remember this better than me, because I don't remember if it was Spencer Kimball or who told this thing. But it's the only general authority story that from my childhood that I actually remember, where, again, these are always set like kids in kind of pioneer Depression era Utah or whatever they all were, and they're out on the farm, and some kid, there's a little oak sapling of a tree. A kid, instead of putting things away, he has this iron wedge and he puts it in the cleft of the tree, and he forgets about it, and he goes about his life, and he grows up and he goes an old man or something like that. And then at a key moment in like a later time in his life, the tree has a wind or something like that, and it splits and crashes on both sides, and it dies, and it kills the tree, which has this been on out life for all this time. And then he realizes there's the wedge that had been grown into it that was creating this intrinsic weakness in the tree. So I don't remember what general authority told this story, but this was the only one that I remember out of all of them. And in so many ways, I think that for our LDS church, this lie that Joseph III founded his church on is a weakness that ends up making the church weak when we have to come to terms with foundational truth claims and the falsehood of several foundational truth claims, this being one of the key ones.
It looks like that talk is called Hidden Wedges.
Okay.
Given by Thomas S. Monson, and it says April 2002. Does that timeline?
No, I would have had to have listened to this. He must have been repeating it from somebody from the 70s.
Oh, wait. Sorry. It begins by saying in April 1966, Spencer B. Kimball gave a memorable address.
Okay.
Called, of an account written by Samuel T. Whitman entitled Forgotten Wedges.
Okay.
So it looks like maybe Monson recycled.
Yeah,
Kimball's
so it's probably recycled more than once.
Of a story, yeah.
Okay. So I probably didn't hear it on the first telling, but like I said, that's the one story that I remembered. And so this is just my advice to, it's, obviously there's other foundational claims that are a problem. I'm sure that the remnant, folks in the remnant community are also committed to Book of Mormon historicity, which I think that people should also get past historicity and literalism, because those are also not tenable ultimately. But people can believe what they want to believe. So that I am not attacking people's faith claims. The issue is simply that these aren't history.
Got it.
And so that brings us back to Michelle, right? So because I have this general concern for disinformation addiction, as I've been calling it in the 21st century, the broad rejection of expertise. And this coupled with my early interaction with Rock Waterman, and then like what had been at that point a very nascent polygamy denial conspiracy in that time period in the early 2000s or in the late 2000s or whatever, 2010. So I went on Michelle's podcast. She's a very nice person, like you say, very earnestly held views, but I just hadn't realized the degree to which this has really gone, it's really exploded, this in the last 10 years. So what I wanted to say, if we go to the next one, is that this is a truth claim as opposed to an academic. Right now, it is not an academic thesis. I know that she's working to found a conference, and that she's maybe going to go in that direction. And so I hope that actually emerges, and we'll see. I think that if she does go into that kind of a study, then ultimately she will, and she supports. If she is open to that, if she's actually open to learning academic methodology, her conclusion will be ultimately the same that all historians have had.
It's unfortunate that she's starting her own journal with Cheryl Bruno, only in the sense that I think if she really wanted to advance the field or prove her case, she would do her research, write an article, publish it in the Journal of Mormon History or in the John Whitmer Journal, or some really popular actual legitimate peer-reviewed historical journal versus start her own journal and then publish in it, which I don't mean to characterize what her plans are.
Yeah.
But to me, going through legitimate, established, peer-reviewed, reputable sources would be the best way.
And by the way, the journals are already very open to publishing, right? So it's not a huge, there's not a huge barrier. This is a very welcoming historians community. When, the very first MHA conference that I went to, I think back in 2003 or something like that, like the very first time I was at one of these conferences, Levina Fielding Anderson just said, "Hey, let's just come in here and let's sit around in a circle. I want to find out who you are and all the things that you're working on." In that same conference, like I was able to have dinner with Dan Vogel, and here's a guy who I'd read all of his books, and he just wants to, he immediately welcoming, and I've known him ever since. So it's and Michelle was at the JWHA conference, which I think was great. And so I think that anyway, it's completely possible to do that. So I'm not trying to make this about Michelle, but what I want to say is that where we are right now in terms of the kind of way that she outlines the deep dives that she has, where she, let's say, kind of haphazardly attacks individual little pieces of evidence and says why she thinks that all of this category of evidence has to be dismissed, or why she doesn't think that this evidence should count, or all of those kind of things. I would say that should be very familiar. That kind of methodology, it's not really methodology, that kind of tactic and strategy should be very familiar to people who are in the Mormon studies community or Mormon stories community. When you think of like kind of the farms or fairs style apologetics, where when you're presented with just this preponderance of evidence about Book of Mormon anachronisms, when we have the evidence of the Book of Mormon's literary dependence on 19th and 17th and 18th and 19th century texts, the King James Bible and so forth, that you then instead of having that kind of taking that evidence all together, they instead drill down on each little anachronism and say, well, they famously have that picture of the tapirs, because you say, oh, well, there's no horses, but maybe the Nephites had tapirs and they were using the horse. That's the most egregious one of those examples, right? And so people like that one as a standout. But in other words, attacking the individual pieces. And so I have in the next slide is a kind of a quote I've made. I haven't given it, I think, in Mormon Stories before, but this often is attributed to me. So when we spend all of our time looking through a microscope at sample A and say that the patterns here look like sample B, what is sample A and B, John?
To me, the one on the left looks like tree bark.
Yes.
The one on the right could be almost anything. It could be something microscopic. It could be a blanket.
So if we go to a slide ahead, it's the hide of an elephant, right? so when we get up so close to this, so it's we can tell ourselves that there's some kind of a meaningful connection between tree bark and elephant hide, right? But if we go to the next one, if we zoom out, we stop doing these things where we're talking about some kind of very micro thing. If we look at the full picture, the evidence, we can see that sample A is actually a forest. And it's not an elephant, right? So the Book of Mormon is a 19th century text. It is not an ancient text. It doesn't matter how, the close up of, the patterns or whatever that people can, spend all their time debating chiasmus. And that doesn't matter, because the conclusion of literary dependence shows us that it's a 19th century text. And so the quote that I have is in the next slide. You can avoid saying, well, this is a forest if you spend all of your time staring at bark through a microscope and telling yourself that the pattern in bark is similar to the pattern in an elephant's hide, which I think is the not a methodology, but the strategy of this kind of apologetics. And so when I went on Michelle's podcast, she said, well, look, I want you to bring is your best evidence of Joseph Smith's The Polygamist, so that she can shoot that down. So it's like a shooting match where she wants to go each individual evidence. And I know that she and other folks who have this faith claim have a laundry list of primary sources that are kind of addressed haphazardly. You argue away, dismiss whole categories of it, because that's how you have to approach this. It's like the Book of Mormon antiquity claims, where they claim that you're actually, if you get a hit, you're doing something. So Nephilim or what's it called? Nahum is like a hit. It doesn't work because you get to score a few hits. That's not how the evidence works. The anachronisms already show it's a 19th century document. It's not about hits and that kind of a thing. So like I was saying about this Brigham Young as the origin of polygamy. So that you have to start then, if you have that thesis, you have to, like you were saying, write out an article, write out a book, a study where you present how that happens. You show where that can be defended in, the primary sources, and then you take all of the sources that we have on polygamy, which are enormous, all of the types, from insiders, outsiders, people who were loyal to Brigham Young, people who hated Brigham Young, how all of these evidence, all of these testimonies, how they fit this counter thesis that you're making. So that has to be done. So it's not a matter of you're just saying, well, I think, somebody brings up DNC 132 and he says, well, I don't think that was actually written by Joseph Smith. Well, I mean, so going each and every one of those little things, going down a rabbit hole on a laundry list is not how we get to historical conclusions, or how when there is a widely accepted conclusion that we have a consensus. That's how we have consensus. So it's not about taking these little pot shots or getting hits or something like that. So
got it.
So one of the things that I did not do then, for this presentation, because we already have the historical consensus. So I'm going to leave. Yeah, if you go to the next one, I'm leaving, going down the rabbit holes to Dan Vogel. So, usually when we talked several times about the Book of Mormon presentation that I did with you on this podcast, that's almost always cited side by side with Dan's. Dan has done excellent. I mean, frankly, much of what I was saying was based on, original research that Dan has done. So he and I agree on a lot of things. Unlike him, I actually don't like dueling with apologists. He loves doing it. So Dan, I do anticipate is going to go down this kind of laundry list. He's already started. So he has on his YouTube channel the first in a series of responses to Michelle. And so, I think we can. Dan has done the same thing with Lars and the Spaulding. His Spaulding book. And so I think that we can anticipate that there'll be plenty more of those from Dan. But what I would like to do in this one is, if we go to the next one, is I want to make a case for the Mormon Stories audience about, just trusting a little bit in expertise, that it's not just historical consensus is not the same as an idea that you want to believe in because of an image that you have of Joseph Smith. So, I've mentioned how I met Randy. He was a proponent of the Spaulding theory. He had been revived, by Craig Criddle's word print analysis. But I really think that Randy largely believed in it because he had preserved this belief that the Book of Mormon was too amazing for Joseph Smith to author. And because, and that's how I met him. And he was mad at me. He hated me for arguing against his view on that. But, because he was a believer in academic expertise, he later became, convinced by the historical consensus on that issue. And so, if we go to the next one, I think our goal should be to, uphold knowledge, not truth claims. In this congregation in Toronto here, one of our mottos that we remember and try to live by as central to the restoration is, we uphold truth wherever it is found. And even when it leads us to places that we're not comfortable with, like learning, in some cases for the members here, that Joseph Smith was the origin of Mormon polygamy. So I just want to say, expertise is valuable. Academically informed history is actually more interesting than conspiracy theories. I recommended already Todd Compton's book. People should read that. People are interested in the documents can read his new documentary version of it. Any of these interesting studies of Nauvoo polygamy, George Smith's whole big long study of Nauvoo polygamy, Dan Vogel's work on Joseph Smith, The Making of the Prophet. Anyway, all of these things are incredibly interesting. Mormon history is so interesting, and ultimately you can be religious without relying on truth claims that that academics have shown to be false. And ultimately, in my opinion, I think it's more healthy when we do. So that's my case.
Beautiful. All right. Well, that's slightly. I expected the framing. I did think towards the end you would pull out some documents or some references. But I understand the point you're making, which is scholarship is a thing and academia is a thing and books are a thing and people need to read them and study them and study their assumptions and their biases when they're arriving at conclusions.
Well, and one of the reasons why, so I can parade a whole bunch of evidence, and we might do this as a second version of this, but I wanted to frame it this way because this isn't about, again, taking my best evidence and putting it up so that then unmethodologically people can just say, well, I don't believe in that one, or I just don't trust, I would never listen to Bennett because he was a person who betrayed Joseph Smith, or we don't want to hear from all of these people who were Brigham Young loyalists. Obviously they don't count, so there'd be all kinds of different ways people can unmethodologically argue against every little bit of evidence and everything like that. For people who are already kind of committed down that path, I don't think that this that kind of debate is very helpful or healthy. And so I try not to engage in it. I'd be very happy to, instead of going to, that's the kind of thing Dan likes to do. And so you can have him on to do those. He can say people have made this cause and that's false and misleading for this and this reason. What I kind of feel like we might do instead is we can just look at all of those different types, of evidence, how consistent they are, all of the different testimony. You can read through all of these kinds of documents. You can also, anybody could do that by reading any one of these books that I was putting up, because they all make that case. That's, they're when I'm talking about a historical consensus, all the historians, agree and tell basically the same story. They disagree about different points. Some people think that Fanny Alger is definitely the first plural wife. Some other people think, no, she was an affair that Joseph Smith was having, and that he later developed, more fully polygamy as an idea, but so to justify that kind of thing.
Beautiful. So, John, I want to honor the spirit of your approach for this first episode. And if you're willing, I would absolutely love to take you up on a second episode.
Yeah.
To kind of show some of the evidence. I did this with Michelle. Would you mind if I just asked you a few questions about some of the positions that she and others like her take, just to hear? You could dispatch with them quickly and just say, you're trying to discredit, ad hominem, or, you can dispatch with a high level response. But I want to give people the taste of your understanding of the evidence as well. And without digging into the documents, kind of conclude with just some high level responses to some of the arguments. Is that okay?
Okay, sure.
Okay. So let's just say, one of the arguments, we've got a lot. John C. Bennett was also, let's just say first presidency level leader in Nauvoo from, 1840 to 1842 kind of time frame. Yes. And obviously John C. Bennett breaks from Joseph Smith and then says Joseph Smith was definitely practicing spiritual wifery or plural marriage. The common response there is that he was a bad guy, which is probably true. He was a liar. He was a abusive person, a charlatan. And so you can't really trust what he had to say about Joseph Smith's polygamy. What would be your quick response to that? So
Bennett is a complicated figure. There's a beautiful biography of Bennett. I'm trying to think of, I can't remember who wrote it. Anyway, I can't remember it now. But one of the great works in the the whole collection of the New Mormon history, there's a great Bennett biography. He is a much more complicated figure than just a simple villain, because for one thing, him getting discredited and kicked out from Joseph Smith, initially he's willing to take that as a kind of an initial scapegoat, and he doesn't think that he's going to get kicked out. He's willing, because of his alliance with Joseph Smith, to be kind of a public scapegoat and things like that. But yeah, Saintly Scoundrel by Andrew Smith is the name of that. I hardly recommend that biography. It's so fun and interesting. And so Bennett it's only after he's down that other people in Joseph Smith's court, like Brigham Young and so on, who do not like this guy he's had all of this. He's the mayor of Nauvoo. He's in the first presidency. In other words, this guy who was a Johnny come lately has suddenly been taking their place that should be for them. And so once he's down, they don't want him back. So Joseph probably would have been willing to forgive him and rehabilitate him or whatever, or after kind of a publicly scapegoating him. It's only when he gets kicked out finally that he goes on this expose run. And one other thing about him is that he does not, it's not like he's not still interested in the movement. He is. He later joins the Strangite Church and is part of Strang's first presidency. So in other words, he's somebody who is very interested in this kind of thing, without being just a negative. It's called Saintly Scoundrel. He's a scoundrel, but he's also more complicated than that. So the counter argument to this thing, though, than just dismissing all, let's say, insiders that Joseph Smith casts out, who then write exposés, is in Bennett's case, he writes some very details, and almost all of those details are later confirmed by insiders. So what he's doing is he is publishing Joseph Smith's secrets, and Joseph Smith denies them in public at the time. But later, Joseph Smith insiders, including, especially the followers of Brigham Young, say, no, that everything that he said is accurate, or, then they release some of these names. They disagree with a bunch of the scandalous stuff, but, the names of the wives, are ultimately confirmed. So it doesn't actually something that we can reject out of hand. Certainly not. We read it for the biases it has.
And I think Michelle even acknowledges that John C. Bennett lists several names as first and last initials,
right,
at the time, and these are all later women who admit or endorse that they were polygamous wives. And Michelle, as I understand it, admits that that's a curiosity to her. That's not compelling evidence,
but it is.
Yes. Okay. The thing that Cheryl Bruno and Cheryl Bruno, who would not identify as someone who denies that Joseph Smith was a polygamist,
right?
The thing that she and Michelle seem to agree upon is that whatever evidence they believe that whatever evidence we do have about polygamy is problematic, that it either comes way too late, or it's possibly forged, or it's not written by credible people, or the documents are second or third hand, blah, blah, blah. And, so just to give a couple examples of that, Michelle Stone would say that the William Clayton journals are not reliable because we don't have the originals, and whatever we do have are partial copies of copies. And so you just can't trust copies of partial journals. What would you say about the William Clayton diaries in response to that argument?
So this standards or whatever that Michelle is imposing on sources seems like it's what you might be trying to do for a criminal court, where you are trying to convict someone of a crime beyond all reasonable doubt, and you have to have a very high standard of that for a person in a criminal court, which is not the standard, of history. That's not how history works. In history, we don't just ignore all evidence until we can absolutely convict somebody with a smoking gun. Rather, we look at all of the evidence and we say, does all the evidence does it support one another? We look at the different biases of if a thing is a later copy, is the later copy that we have, then we can do a literary analysis of it. Is it filled with anachronisms? If people are right, if William Clayton was forging this journal as part of Brigham Young's conspiracy 7 years later or whenever he's doing it, he would instantly be introducing all kinds of anachronisms that would make the journal non-credible, and it would be able to be exposed using literary criticism, right? So it's not just a matter of saying it's late. It's a matter then of doing the literary analysis on it and saying, here are the 200 anachronisms that William Clayton has made when he's claiming he's in Nauvoo, when in fact we know he's writing this 8 years later in Salt Lake or something like that.
There's a one response. I'll share some comments or questions from the audience. Eric writes, Andrew F. Smith in his biography on page 125 to 126 shows proof that John C. Bennett would delete, add, and omit and forge materials. Therefore, he cannot be trusted. What say you, John Hamer, to that?
Yeah, so Bennett is a liar. So yeah, you're not going to read Bennett's expose. Bennett's expose is also a hodgepodge. So it has good material in it, and it has stuff that he just randomly recycles. He's just trying to put out a book that he wrote really fast in order to have a bestseller, so that he can have that accompany his best. He made all kinds of money doing these speeches as he did, Barnes Under Cross. So like all historical sources, we have to analyze everything that Bennett has, in terms of the biases that he has. So Bennett is a self-promoter. He's biased. He is trying to show, a particular thing. He's trying to not make himself be as guilty of it as he is. He doesn't want to be arrested for, polygamy, which is not legal. So he's doing all kinds of things that means that we can't take him on face value. But that doesn't mean we dismiss every single thing that he writes, because some of the things that he includes are information that we can then look at in concert with other sources. The names, like you said, of those initials, those women who later came forward, and they also testified that they had been married to Joseph Smith, just as Bennett alleged. Well, then that is why we believe Bennett. If we only had Bennett, if we didn't have all the rest of it, we would dismiss Bennett because of all of those reasons. But because it is consonant with the historical record, then it's not only proves it buttresses the later testimonies, and it also brings it into Joseph Smith's lifetime for sure.
Dan Vogel, he's in the chat. We love you, Dan. Dan writes, Emma lied about polygamy, but we trust her account of the translation. And when he says we, he means, I think believing Mormons, or maybe he does as well. I was just going to make the point that Eric Martineau's accusations against John C. Bennett sound a lot like the accusations against Joseph Smith, or the evidence against Joseph Smith, that he would delete, add, omit, and forge materials. He cannot be trusted. And that's a real problem. You can't really have it both ways. Mormons can't pick and choose who they want to discredit, but then say Joseph Smith and Emma are heroes, because I think, that lying for the Lord point that you made earlier absolutely applies to Joseph, and yet lots of believing Mormons still, and his, demonstrably either forging and or false translating documents, clearly would undermine his authority if you're trying to hold Joseph by the same standard you're holding John C. Bennett. So I think that's something that people have to work out. Okay, thank you for entertaining these questions anyway. I have a few more.
Okay.
And I think I know where you're going to go with this one. When, I think that the strongest case for polygamy has at least recently been highlighted by Radio Free Mormon, where he basically is able to show parallels between newspaper reports of a meeting that I believe Hiram Smith had with the Nauvoo City Council, where people, or in diary accounts, I'm always rough on the details, but basically there's really good evidence that all the main points in D&C 132 were then included in the Nauvoo Expositor, which was released before Joseph died, obviously. And there's even, I think, Nauvoo City Council minutes where those who were in attendance report that a revelation was read to the people at the Nauvoo City Council as well. And I'm probably massacring the history, but that's kind of that's kind of RFM's best case, that this is really open and shut. If D&C 132 was reflected in the Nauvoo Expositor, and the Nauvoo Expositor was published by someone really close to Joseph Smith, meaning William Law, before even Joseph Smith died, open and shut case. And I don't think Michelle Stone has presented a really viable response to that. But basically what she has said is that you can't trust William and Jane Law because William Law was ambitious. He wanted to replace Joseph Smith. He got things wrong in the Nauvoo Expositor. He wanted to become the new prophet. And these are my words, not hers. And he was, an apostate and disgruntled. And so for all those reasons, you can't trust William Law. I think I know where you're going to respond, but go ahead.
well, we have like a later testimony of William Law. So he's interviewed after the whole Nauvoo period, wherein he's more reflective, and he kind of says he was a fool to have done the expositor, that he should have quietly sold out all of his, because he lost so much money and everything like that to do it, right? He should have quietly sold out all of his interests and just left the movement and not have made this whole thing happen the way he did. I think that based on like where things went and his actions and so forth, I don't think we can read into his character that he was ambitious, that he wanted to replace Joseph Smith. I think he very reluctantly took that path because he couldn't get Joseph Smith to leave the path that he was on. He wanted to, go back and, reform Mormonism and get it away from this practice that ultimately was going to be so destructive. And so anyway, but in terms of that's William Law's character. So again, what we have with every single individual, we can't just dismiss people because they break with Joseph Smith and they're disloyal to Joseph Smith or something like that. That's something, again, that's a religious position, a religious proposition that you have, not a historical one. We read all of the characters of history for their inherent biases that they have, what they're doing. He is, we have to read the expositor for that. And so, but nevertheless, as you were alluding to, the case made at Radio Free Mormon, to the extent to which it doesn't matter what the bias is, to the extent to which the expositor includes details that are entirely consonant with D&C 132, that is evidence that D&C 132 is LDS D&C 132 is an accurate copy of the revelation that Joseph was circulating to Hiram and to the city council and to Emma and so forth. So I'm sure the argument that Michelle would make on D&C 132 is, once again, we don't have the original because, according to I think it's Clayton, Emma burned the original with Joseph, but he had a copy of it, and that's the copy. Once again, the way you
and she would also say it came way late, that it wasn't published and included in the D&C until the 60s or 70s.
Yeah, but the manuscript isn't that late. But anyway, of this copy. But anyway, whatever year of the manuscript, especially, let's say if it was way late, let's say it was written in 1870. If you look at the text of D&C 132, the church in the 1870s wouldn't have written it that way. People immediately introduce anachronisms when they forge documents that are later. D&C 132 is just dripping with all kinds of things that Joseph is trying to persuade Emma and arguing with it, and it has the context of the time. So again, the case that you don't just say a text is late, you have to show, prove that it is not, this copy is an actual forged document later, and you can prove that through anachronisms. That's how we have dealt with Book of Mormon authorship. That's why we can conclusively say the Book of Mormon is a 19th century document. So if this was a later forgery, it would have anachronisms. It wouldn't reflect the context of the Nauvoo time, and it wouldn't then have that same exact, be consonant with things like the expositor, because the forgers wouldn't care about what William Law might have said in the expositor. They would care about justifying polygamy as they were practicing it in the 1870s in Utah.
Dan Vogel, always coming in clutch in the comments. He's writing, DNC 132 was copied by Joseph Kingsbury before he left Nauvoo about July 1843, which was again a year before Joseph was killed. So yeah, there aren't going to be anachronisms in DNC 132.
Well, there you go. Yeah. So yeah, Dan is on top of all of the all of the documents. We're so happy to have him. And like I said, I hope, Dan, you don't mind that I have left it to you to go down the rabbit hole with all, with the apologists on all of this. So,
John Hamer, what would you say? You know, we know that I think it was in the Temple Lot case where so many of the women who claimed to be Joseph's plural wives were asked or forced by some accounts to sign these affidavits that they were wives of Joseph Smith in very deed, meaning that they did have sexual relations with them. I think Michelle Stone's argument there and others is that they were forced to sign those affidavits, that Brigham Young was a tyrant, and he, you know, you almost get the impression that, and there's, I think Cheryl and Michelle both claim that these were almost form letters that these women were forced to sign. So they weren't written by the women. They were just form letters. There wasn't even significant variation between them. And that Brigham Young, as a tyrant, forced them to sign it because he was trying to defend his evil practices. That's my characterization of their argument. I'm sure I'm getting it wrong, but I think I'm conveying the sense of it. What would you say to someone who's entertaining that theory?
well, so the Temple Lot case, like you say, is a this is a case that the RLDS Church brought for its own bias purposes. The RLDS Church felt like it had won an important, but it wasn't really, but an important case in Ohio over the Kirtland Temple, where the RLDS Church gained possession of Kirtland Temple through adverse possession, which is to say that they just happened to own it, and they were paying the taxes on it long enough. But in the course of that case, there was a ruling of finding where a local judge seemed to indicate that the RLDS Church was the original church, still constituted. In other words, it was still functioning as the early church. And that is all our LDS people have ever wanted to say. In other words, we're the original church, not the LDS people. They've distorted it because they changed the doctrines of the church. And so that had become a good public relations issue as far as the RLDS people were concerned. And so they brought the Temple Lot case with the purpose of trying to establish the same thing. And so there was an actual battle between the churches because the RLDS Church is trying to get a legal ruling that they were that it was the actual true church or whatever, the original church. But anyway, so yes, there were all kinds. Part of the issue was, did the LDS Church change the doctrines to add polygamy, or was polygamy part of the early church? And that was therefore why there were all of this testimony on this. And so my response to even Cheryl and also Michelle and their reading of these is, I think you have to, they don't, to me, read like form letters. I think that there is, individual details and testimony from different women. But more importantly, it is not only Brighamites who have these testimonies. So Strangites come out of the works, and they also testify about polygamy. So there is no reason for Strangites to assert, oh yeah, Joseph Smith was the founder of this, when Brigham Young was the head of this conspiracy that Joseph Smith thought these guys are opponents of Brigham Young. So again, we have all of this testimony from, it's not just Brigham Young loyalists. We have it also from all of these people, as we were just seeing with William Law and Bennett, people who break with Joseph Smith. But then we have people who are Joseph Smith loyalists who are opponents of Brigham Young. And so they're also having these testimonies and these practices. And that includes in the Temple Lot case. And so those people are not answering form letters, that Brigham Young is controlling. They're other churches.
So the idea that these women were forced by Brigham Young or others to sign these affidavits or to make these statements.
So for that particular claim, you then look at each individual woman, look at is there any evidence of that? So is there, do they have then a journal where one of these women said, Brigham Young's thugs came and made me sign this thing? I mean, you can look into those kind of cases. It's not just something that you just say. You can demonstrate that by looking at the rest of the evidence, if there is any, which I don't think there is. So, but anyway, I mean, those testimonies, when I've read them, are compelling.
So I'll just share a comment that you may find entertaining or you may not. Someone named Alexia says, this is so disappointing. And so I said, what is disappointing, Alexia? And then Alexia says, the lack of evidence of historians, the lack of evidence that historians bring and lack of background of the people from the time versus Michelle, who gives good details of the relationships.
Yeah.
So
unfortunately, again, there is such a preponderance of evidence. This is why I wanted to, again, frame what the issue here is, to explain that that we are dealing with the same kind of a thing that we have with Book of Mormon authorship, where there is a forest here, but yes, is the thing that Michelle's doing, this apologetic thing that the Farms people do about Book of Mormon authorship, where you drill down every single anachronism. You say, well, maybe there was metallurgy in Peru, or maybe horses were tapirs, or every single one of these little detail things, where you try to explain away each individual little piece of evidence haphazardly and without any methodology. That's not a valid framework. And so if historians, Dan can go ahead and do this, but if historians follow apologists down every little rabbit hole, we're following into that trap of a non-methodological, just a faith claim that is being backed up by haphazard statements. Yeah. So that's why, yeah. I mean, so yeah, we can make the case, read any one of these books.
Alexia, he did address it. He did bring receipts. He brought 14 books for you to read. And that's John Hamer's evidence presented today that Joseph Smith was a polygamist.
Yeah, and so we can go through, some of the details of it, all these primary sources, like I said, in the next episode. But I'm not going to go and respond to each one of these. I say that, this is not how I did the Book of Mormon authorship one with you, right? So I didn't start and say, oh, well, this explanation about Nahum is wrong. This explanation about chiasmus is wrong. If I just go down that whole laundry list, we're playing into this apologetic game that has already derailed us from finding truth.
Well, let me ask you about that. So, for those who are interested, there's a Mormon polygamy conference that I believe starts tomorrow, May 21st. It goes till May 22nd. I think Taylor Petrie is presenting. I think you're right. Todd Compton's presenting. Again, Barbara Jones Brown. A lot of big names in Mormon studies. Some feel like it's a mistake to platform Michelle Stone at all. Some were saying I shouldn't have had her on the podcast. But then I talked to Barbara Brown and and others. And, there are people who just say, no, you engage people. And by engaging people, more sunlight is the best disinfectant. And so what do you think? Do you think it's healthy that Cheryl and others are engaging with Michelle Stone and the tens or hundreds of thousands of people she represents? Or do you think it's a mistake to engage with them?
No, I think it's... to the extent that Cheryl wants to do that and people are excited about doing it, to the extent that anybody wants to spend all the time doing, debunking videos or any one of the things, looking at every single one of those points, I think that's absolutely fine. I'm not telling people what they should or shouldn't do in that way. I don't do that kind of apologetic dueling. What I would try to do is, just like we did when we lay out the case for the Book of Mormon evidence one, I would like to then, it's very difficult because there's so much of the evidence. But anyway, where I would show it into those 4 quadrants that I was giving, where instead of any kind of, this kind of focusing on, all of the pieces that are that they want to throw away and totally discredit, what I would want to show how, like we've already talked about, how the testimony of these women that have come forward and Brigham and who are followers of Brigham Young, which they discount because they said, well, Brigham Young made you do it. And yet it buttresses this testimony from John C. Bennett, which they want to discount because John C. Bennett is a disloyal scoundrel. And yet the fact is that these two completely antagonistic sources buttress each other, means that we can't just throw both of them out for these arbitrary reasons that they're citing. So that would be how we want to make, show the full case, which I'll do with you later. In the next episode. Yeah.
All right. Well, today has been amazing, John Hamer. Before we end, I want to give you a chance to promote or talk about anything you're doing with your Community of Christ Toronto congregation, with your website, which again is called, you can go to centerplace.ca. That's CENTRE place.ca. And then also there's the YouTube channel, Center Place. Tell everybody all the cool things y'all are doing, so that they can follow you, because you do a weekly broadcast sharing history and knowledge, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have two weekly broadcasts. So the one that we do is on Sunday, is the Sunday service, our congregation. So I'm pastor of the congregation. Our congregation is online. So we live stream a service at 12 Eastern time every week. And because we are not committed to focusing on scriptural literalism and historicity, we're not making any kind of faith claims that, like any of the things in the Bible where we're hearing about supernatural things or anything like that, no claims like that is happening. And instead, what we're looking at is this tradition we have in the Restoration in Christianity of having a faith community where you can come together to talk about life issues, to consider the meaning of life, to work on activist goals together, to work on charity together. So as a result of having a very different kind of church than I think most of your listeners will be familiar with, we just continuously are having new people who come from either, ex-Mormons or ex-RLDS people from back in the day, but just as frequently people from other literalistic, fundamental Christian traditions who got ground up because they were taught all of these things about the Bible that they no longer believe are true, but they're still interested in the topics because they were abused by their churches, because they were gay and lesbian or trans or something like that, or just women who are not given equality of purpose in a lot of churches. So we're able to come together and have that church experience. And so lots of people are finding that and finding it to be unlike anything that they've experienced before. So people can come to that if they're interested in that. If they're not interested in church, which is fine. I also then on Tuesday nights, I have a history, theology, philosophy lecture on the same channel. Many more people, we have 80,000 subscribers to that. Many more people listen to that. It's interesting if you're interested in things like, Bible topics, again, history of early Christianity, but then all kinds of other ones, then you can find those. If you go to live, the live ones are the ones that you'd be looking at. And so recent ones of these podcasts are things like, so these are popular ones. So who wrote Genesis? History of the Last 10 Tribes. What do we know about the historical Jesus? Why Paul's churches won in early Christianity? What's the origin of the papacy? These are just some of the examples. Who was Baal? Lost books of the Bible, that kind of thing. So if you're interested in those kind of topics, we talk about those, and we do that from an academic perspective, not from a religious perspective. And I've been told by everyone from Randy's brother Jimmy to my brother Ben that I also speak with a sonorous enough voice that they can use me to go to sleep to.
You tell me that all the time. They listen to Mormon stories to fall asleep.
So if you're looking for more things to listen to fall asleep to, you can always use my channel.
All right. Well, that's amazing, John Hamer. I'm so grateful you were able to do today's episode. I'm grateful for your friendship, for all you've done. Any final words of wisdom that you want to share before we wrap up today?
I just want to, again, say that, I think that actual history is so incredibly interesting. I'm one of, I guess, the person from my era who, if you can see behind me, I love books. I read books on paper. This is an old-fashioned thing that was made fun of in Star Trek, but who knew it would happen so soon in our lifetimes? And there's just so much. When I was a little kid, I thought Mormon history was intensely boring because I was taught the correlated manual version of it, and it's only when I actually started reading the books historians wrote that I realized this is so interesting, so fun. We are part of a tradition that is so rich, and so I would just jump into it and embrace it.
All right. Well, John Hamer, you're a great friend. You're a great mind, great heart. Thank you so much for sharing us your thoughts today, and let's have you back soon.
All right. Thank you so much, John. I'll love to come back.
And thanks for joining us today on Mormon Stories. Please subscribe to this channel right now on YouTube. Please like this episode, comment on it, and share it. That engagement encourages YouTube to share this episode in the algorithm so that other people can take advantage of it. We want to thank our donors. We have so many donors, at least a few thousand donors who donate monthly or annually to support the Open Stories Foundation. We couldn't do this without you, so thank you, donors, for making this happen. A small percentage of our revenue comes from Google ads or YouTube ads or Spotify ads. The overwhelming majority of our revenue comes from just donors. So thanks to our donors, but also we would really appreciate it if you value this type of content and you want to see it continue. All you have to do is go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button, become a monthly donor, and we promise we publish our financial statements every year in our 990s as a 501c3 nonprofit. Your tax deductions in the U.S. are tax deductible, and we do our best to be as transparent as possible and to give all the money that you give to the cause, which is providing informed consent for Mormons and the rest of the world, and then supporting Mormons and others in religious faith crises and help them find community. So thanks for joining us today. Thanks for the live stream. Thanks to everyone who makes all this possible. Thanks to Dan Vogel for being in the comments. Thanks to all the great historians like Fawn Brody and Todd Compton and George Smith and others that have done such great work. Stay tuned for more great episodes on Mormon Stories in the weeks, months, and years ahead. Be good to each other. Be kind to each other. And we'll see you all again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care.